Welcome to the One Player Podcast, the one show to rule them all. I'm your host Albert, and this is episode 342. Hey everyone, welcome back. This is episode 342. This is it's still just me, and this is a back to the table episode where I'm talking about the Lord of the Rings, the card game from Fantasy Flight. It's a living card game. I talked about this episode way back when it first came out. Gosh, that's probably like in the first 15 episodes or so. Let's check. Because this is good radio, yo. One Player Podcast. BGG, go, yo, ho. Wow, this was the third game I covered on the podcast way back. Brand new podcast, and the game came out right around then, I think. I'm pretty sure it came out after I started the podcast. So I haven't talked about it in ages, but it is a game that has been back to the table many times for me. This is definitely not a long forgotten game. Part of the reason I'm covering it is because, well, to fill up some time, because it's hard to do an episode a week, and I want to keep doing that, so there we go. I'll talk about a game I can talk about easily, with little research, a little effort. It's a living card game, so it's kind of like, compared to Magic the Gathering, that's what I always do. It's kind of like Magic the Gathering. It's a game where you build a deck of cards, you choose what cards you put into it, so it's totally deck construction, and then you go and play against a scenario that's pre-built, and using your cards, you try and beat the scenario. This is Lord of the Rings themed, so you are playing as characters from Lord of the Rings, generally speaking, heroes from Lord of the Rings, and going through different scenarios, some based directly out of the books of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, some inspired by the stories and set in that world, but not necessarily. Sometimes they're original stories that were created by the designers at Fantasy Flight. So this game came out, I think, back in 2011. I will say I love this game. I play this a ton. This is my number one game. I have played this way more than any other game I have. I used to play a lot of Magic the Gathering when it first came out in the early 90s with my friends, and I would play regularly up until about when I moved to San Francisco in 95. So up until then, I was playing all the time. I still don't think I've played quite as many games of this as many games as I've played of this. Or maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know. I don't think so. So I've played like 360 games of this now. No idea how many I played of Magic, because now I track it on BGG. So in those 13 years, this game has grown a ton. And what I mean by that is a lot of expansions came out since then. The original game was a box. It brought enough cards for 2 players, but you could play up to 4 players if you bought 2 sets. And it's they call it 1 through 4 players. I would call it 1 through 2, really, but whatever. They make the scenarios for up to 4, so they always intended that 4 people could play, even if you had to buy 2 sets. It brings 3 quests, 3 scenarios to play against, and plenty of cards to make different types of decks. There's 4 different spheres, and you pick your heroes, and you pick from different spheres of power, and the heroes and some cards are associated with those spheres. So you tend to theme your deck around certain spheres. As I said, much more content has come out since then. They've come out with different small scenarios and packages. They're individual scenarios one at a time with some player cards, and larger boxes that would have 3 scenarios and a bunch of player cards. And generally speaking, those larger boxes, they would be the start of a cycle. They would release that box with 3 scenarios, and then the next 6 individual sets that came out would all tie back to that box, and would even use some of the scenario cards from it. And a lot of the player cards that you add might tie to some of the player cards that came out in that. So it'd all be a large set. In the end, you get a total of 9 scenarios, and a bunch of player cards. Something like 8 new heroes, and I think something like 6 different types of cards in each scenario besides the heroes. 3 of each of those cards. And over the years, they've come out with, 6, 7, 8 plus probably another 6, at least 15 of those cycles, which includes 6 boxes that are just the Lord of the Rings books and 2 more for the Hobbit book, and those didn't have the extra set. Those are extra set of 6 packs of individually packed scenarios. The Lord of the Rings campaign, for example, is 18 scenarios total across 6 boxes, so 3 scenarios per box. So yeah, so this game has grown a lot. There's a ton of cards, ton of scenario cards, and a ton of player cards to build your own custom decks with. The types of decks you can build has grown a lot and changed. And for me, that's a huge foreign part of the game, is building these decks and tweaking them and adjusting them to make, I think, interesting thematic decks. I enjoy making decks that are thematic and fit the lore of the Lord of the Rings. For example, a deck based around hobbits that tends to be more sneaky and not big fighty characters, or a deck of elves, or whatever. There's different things you could do. So yeah, with so many cards now, there's tons of options. A lot of times you even have to build decks, or you build a deck and you play with it, and it does well in some scenarios and not well in others, and you end up having to tweak it and maybe remove some of the characters, or not the hero cards, but the rest of the deck. Remove the deck cards and change them out for other stuff. You say, oh, this one doesn't really work in this scenario, so you start tweaking it. At least that's how I play, to work in a specific scenario, and going back and forth, just trying to get a deck that works well. Some decks tend to work well with many scenarios, some don't. My Dwarven deck, for example, is fantastic, and when I get frustrated with a scenario and I just can't beat it, I will pull out my Dwarf deck and usually do really well with that one. And that tends to be fun. But I prefer to first try a less powerful deck and challenge myself and have fun exploring it up to a point. Besides all that new content, they also added something. They added campaigns. Specifically, they added it with the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, and then with the Lord of the Rings, where you actually play 3 stories in order, and there's a little bit of continuance from game to game. Like especially in the Lord of the Rings. Actually, I don't remember this in the Hobbit ones, but definitely, no, I do. Especially in the Lord of the Rings, though, there are cards that you will get, and then you have these cards for the rest of your campaign. You may lose some later on, or they might be tied to a specific hero that you have, and if that hero dies, you've lost that hero and that card that went with them. But generally speaking, otherwise, the cards would follow you throughout the game. Some good cards, some bad cards. So those campaigns have been interesting, though I don't know that it's my favorite way to play. So they've added new ways to play, ton of content. They've also added easy mode and nightmare mode. Nightmare mode got added from early on, really. And if you find the game too easy, you could swap out some of the scenario cards for the nightmare mode version cards for that scenario. So you would buy a specific nightmare mode scenario for each scenario they made. Yes, made, because there is some discontinuation. Besides the nightmare, there's also easy mode, or as someone once called it, story mode, in which the game is not so difficult and challenging anymore, and you get to play through it and explore the story aspect more than the challenge of beating the game aspect. And you still got to beat it. It's just not as crazy difficult, which I sometimes find frustrating. Some scenarios are just so ridiculously hard. So over the years, they've added a lot of ways to play and a lot of content and all sorts of things. Now, I did say not everything's available. They did a reboot. Gosh, it was before COVID, I'm pretty sure. So I'd say 2019, maybe 2018. I don't remember for sure. But they stopped releasing new cycles and new cards and said, you know what, we're going to do, revise the old edition. They released a new one, all the same cards from the original game, but they released enough for 4 players from the... No, I don't think that's true. I think it might still be... I think it is 4 players from the get-go. Plus, there's more of a lot of the cards. So, like in the original version, there's only like 2 Gandalf cards or something. And you want 3 in every deck a lot of times. So 2 was not enough for barely enough for 1 player. Definitely not enough for 2 players, really. So there's not enough of all the cards that you could build a couple different decks and have more choices, make it more satisfying. They also added a campaign mode, like what I had just mentioned a little while ago, for all those original scenarios. And then they've also repackaged, when they release the cycles, how they do it. Similar to what they've done with Arkham Horror, if you're familiar with that. They, instead of now buying 1 big box and 6 little one packages after that, they split it up into 2 components. One is the scenario cards, the campaign cards, and the other one is all the player cards. So if you really just want more player cards and don't care about the scenarios, you could just get all those player cards that would have come in it. Or if you do want the scenarios, you could buy those and choose to get or not get the player cards. So it kind of thing makes it a little easier to buy, and probably a little, in theory at least, a little cheaper because there's less individual packaging. It's more in bulk, I guess. Unfortunately, they haven't released all the original content, and I'm not sure they plan to, so I think some of that original content is unavailable. I'm not following all that closely enough to know exactly what they're going to do, but it doesn't sound like they're going to really solve it. So some of the older stuff is harder to find and going to end up getting more expensive. You may have to go look on eBay and places like that. I didn't say whatnot. All the art has stayed the same for the game. It basically just improved the packaging, and like they've added a new counter, the same counters as before, but they added new denominations, so it's a little easier to manage, things like that, which is nice. And each campaign now brings a little set of campaign cards, each of those boxes, which if you have the original versions, you won't get those, but they do have those available for free to download and print out if you want to. So that becomes an option. So, I don't have to go and rebuy all these things that I already own. I could just print out those campaigns if I want to play them. And I haven't decided if I'm going to or not yet. Like I said, my campaign I don't think is my favorite way to play yet, but I may get them at some point. Yeah. Now, like I also said, I don't know if they're going to continue releasing stuff or not. I think they would if it keeps doing well. I can't imagine why not, other than maybe if the license gets too expensive. In that case, they would have to probably just stop selling any Lord of the Rings card game, which would be a real shame. Fortunately, there is third-party content available, and Fantasy Flight does seem to be happy with this and encourage it. There's something called a long extended party. It is a aLeP for short. It is a group of people who are creating new content for the game on their own. Totally volunteer thing, and it's all available for free to download and print out yourself, so you can print out your own cards, or you could even get it printed professionally through a couple different services. And if you go to the aLeP site, they give you a lot of information on all of that, on how to do it, whether you want to print it yourself, or they could point out a couple of third-party services that will do it. And they're releasing content just like the original stuff, in that they release a new expansion with 3 scenarios in it, and 6 individual scenarios after that, one at a time, with both player cards and scenario cards. So they're releasing new heroes and new characters and all that, which is really cool. Yeah, I'm really excited by that. I have bought that, not all of that content, because actually it's more expensive than the original stuff is if you bought it from Fantasy Flight, because it's print on demand. But I have purchased like the first campaign cycle of theirs, and I haven't started playing it yet, but I'm really excited to. I'm really excited to see the new cards and how those play. I did play one of the scenarios so far. They released... So, one of the things that really bugged me about the Lord of the Rings campaign from Fantasy Flight is that they stopped short. The campaign ended when you destroyed the Ring of Mount Doom. If you're familiar with the novels, there's a whole bunch more after that in the books. Frodo and Sam get to celebrate and spend some time with their friends that they've become... I hope I'm not spoiling anything for you. They come reunited with their friends and go to Gondor and spend some time with the new king and their friends and whatnot, and eventually decide to return to Hobbiton, where there is a pretty substantial event that happens there. So aLeP went ahead and released that as a scenario to finish off the Lord of the Rings campaign. And I played through that one. And you know what? That was actually one of my favorite scenarios so far. I really enjoyed it. I was really impressed with it. It was just fun. I found it really fun. So like I said, I'm really excited about that content. Besides them, there is other content you could get. There's somebody that made a First Age campaign, or I believe it's a whole campaign, maybe just a single scenario, and they made all these character cards for First Age characters and First Age adventures. This is based, if you're familiar with Tolkien, with the Silmarillion, which is a book he wrote. I think, and I haven't read it, it's a collection of stories, a bunch of stuff that happened long before the stories of the Hobbits and the Lord of the Rings, and ages before. Sort of like if the Lord of the Rings was in modern time, this is kind of like a ancient Roman, ancient Greek history, that far back sort of thing. So somebody did that. I have not looked into that partially because I'm not as interested in the first stage, and also because unlike aLeP, where aLeP actually has commissioned original art for all their stuff, this person that made this went and found art online and used that, and I don't feel as comfortable with that because they've appropriated that art for the game. For aLeP, they pay artists to make art, and as a matter of fact, you could go. They have a Patreon campaign where you donate like $1 or $2 every month. I don't remember exactly how much it is, and you contribute to making the art. And when it gets made, each month, they actually send you the art in original, really high detail size. So you actually have a copy of the art for your own personal use. And later on, you'll see that art in the cards that come out. So that's pretty neat. So yeah, a lot of content's available. Ton of content, even if the old stuff is maybe potentially harder to find. I'm kind of annoyed that they're potentially not going to reprint the old stuff. My understanding is that's not in the plan specifically. And that seems really unfortunate because there's a whole lot of player cards that I think people would love to be able to get. And yeah, I know Magic the Gathering, right? They do that sort of thing where you aren't going to really buy the old cards. Except once in a while they reprint them because, well, people want to be able to have a chance to get them in. It's going to make them a lot of money. Lord of the Rings, they use an LCG model, which is different, something they came up with, which is basically instead of buying packs of random cards, you would buy a scenario or a package, and you knew exactly what cards were in it. All the player cards and all the scenario cards was all predefined, so there's no mystery. So it made collecting the game way easier. If you just bought something, you knew what you were getting. You weren't going to miss out on anything. New players are not going to miss out on all those old cards that an older player has available to them, and that limits your choices in what you can do. And if you're really interested in making thematic decks, that could become harder if certain characters that you really would like to have are now available. You could proxy cards in, you could go online to different websites and find out what the cards are, and maybe print out pictures and stick them in a sleeve and play that way. Or you could, I think some people play digitally. So there are ways around it, but I don't know. It seems really unfortunate for an LCG model specifically. So yeah, a ton of content available. Some of it may be harder to get, but it is out there. Yeah, that's one of the things I like about it. It's just the expansiveness of it. The cost, well, the new stuff, I guess, it's retail prices, so that'd be about what you'd expect for a card game for 2 players with that number of cards in the box. It's about $60. You could find it online for maybe $55. These are rough numbers for the base game, and then the scenarios and expansions, I'm not sure how much they are. Probably more than the base game because it has more in it, but yeah, I'm not sure. I bought my stuff all originally in the older way, and gosh, I know I've spent a fortune on it that way. I do have all the main contents. I don't have the Nightmare cards. I have a few Nightmare decks, but not many. But all the main contents, I added up how much I spent, and it was well over $1,000. I think it was closer to $1,800 over 13 years. So it's a lot of time. There's also some scenarios that they published in the past that are not available now. They were just one-shot scenarios without player cards. A lot of these were things that got released at Gen Con and then was available from them when Fantasy Flight used to do a print-on-demand service. And some of these things were available as print-on-demand. And those, I think, are generally harder to find and possibly more expensive. And you can still find stuff around. I was at a game store recently in the Atlanta area, and they had a couple old scenarios. They even found a Nightmare deck. I bought that. But they had a few other older things that I'd seen. And I think some of the stuff you could find, say, for example, on Amazon or different places for not too expensive, maybe even like retail prices. I don't think there's a whole lot of markup on everything. Some things, yes, but not everything. A huge amount. So I don't know. The cost, I think, is an issue. Well, let me talk about how I feel about the game. I guess you can imagine. But we'll come back and talk a little about the accessibility for a new player. So how do I like this game? Yeah, I really like this game a lot. I love the deck building. I find it really fun. I love the adventures. I'm sorry, not the deck building, but the deck construction. I love the adventures of the Lord of the Rings, and the campaigns are really satisfying. I like that process, the iterative process of playing the games and tweaking my decks and playing more until I get a deck that works for that scenario, and then move on to the next one. I like playing this in a what they call progression style, which means when you play, you only play with the cards that are available up until the point of that scenario. And I don't do that exactly, but I kind of do. So what I've been doing is, since the game came out, I would get the packs when they became available, and I didn't get everything at the beginning, but I would get packs. And when I played, so therefore I would open up the pack and play up until that pack. And as I bought new packs, I wouldn't open them; those would stay sealed. So those cards were unavailable to me until I got to that scenario to play it. I have jumped around. There's a couple campaigns that I wasn't that interested in at the time, so I didn't buy them when they first came out, and I skipped to the next one. So as I play the scenarios, I make those cards available to myself, and I have jumped around. So some older cards are not available to me yet, even though I own them, and will be available once I play it. And so it's not exactly the normal progression style, which is by order of release. It's my own version of it. But yeah, and it sounds crazy to have that and not use it, but that kind of helps keep me motivated to finish scenario and move on to the next one so I could unlock new content. It keeps that part of it fun for me. If I had all the player cards shrink wrapped already and available for me to pick from and play, I would lose some of the fun of trying out new scenarios. So I enjoy that progression style. And honestly, I would say if you're a new player and say you bought a used set of the game and had a bunch of scenarios, I would consider trying to do something like that, though that might be difficult to sort all those cards out and limit yourself. Because it'll just be challenging to figure out which cards are which. Each card has a symbol telling which set it's from and the card number and all that, so you can figure that out, and you could look online by card names, I guess. So it'll be a bit of work, but it might be worth it, honestly, because here's the thing. My experience is when I have about a used game and has a ton of content, I get overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. And always what has helped me a lot is to step back, separate, like the game has expansions, separate all those expansions out, just go back to the base game and start with that and ignore everything else. Get familiar with the base game and then add other content in. And I find that helps with any type of game if I've traded for it and gotten expansions with it. Or even say bought a game that is brand new and there's a ton of content now available. I will pace myself and introduce things slowly to myself. That really helps, especially with games like this that have hundreds of cards. Because that becomes so overwhelming. And with that many cards, and you're not familiar with the game, you don't know what to do, where to go. Wow, yeah, I would get frustrated and just give up. There are other ways, though. You can, for example, go online and find some suggested decks people have come up with and build those decks and play with that. And then as you're learning with that deck, now you can start tweaking that deck if you want to, or trying other things as you get familiar with the game. But really, it's that whole jumping in with a huge, just giant pool of cards, not knowing where to go. Because unlike a game like Marvel Champions, also by Fantasy Flight now, when you get a new hero, a new set, it says, oh, here's this hero. It already works. These are the cards for him. And just try that. And you can tweak it, but you're given a playable deck from the get-go each time. So yeah, I really like this game because I've played it a bunch. I think I have 360 something plays of it logged. And it's a kind of game where I'll play a bunch and then take a break from it for a few months, maybe a year, maybe a couple of years even, and then come back and play a bunch. And it's always fun, and I always like to just continue from where I left off and keep going. And I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it a ton. I hadn't played in about 2 years, and I recently sometime in 2022 was the last time I played until recently. And then I think in March, I picked it up again. Me and my son started playing, and I started playing again solo. And in that time, I've played about another 70 or 80 games in the last 3 months. So yeah, it's and each scenario is so different. If you have the core game with 3 scenarios and another box with another 3 or 4, 9 scenarios, whatever the number happens to be, that's a ton of replayability right there. And you could play it, and you could change the deck and try that out and see. And the funny thing here is that a lot of times I don't like the kind of game where you have the scenario and then you have to pick, like, say, especially war games. There's some war games like that where Dan Verson's Leader series, for example, you pick your airplane and you pick the missiles that you're going to use and the crew, and then you go off and do the mission. And I have found that extremely unsatisfying where I'm choosing what to pick from the beginning, and then go do the mission. And yet, for a game like this, that's deck construction, and it's the same concept where I have my mission, and now I have to choose what to take into the mission, which cards to put into my deck. I really enjoy it. Maybe it's the theme. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's similar to Magic the Gathering in playstyle, and I'm very familiar with that already, so that helped. I don't know. I really enjoyed it in this game. Tons of replayability. Games can... How long does a game take? It depends. I mean, if I do poorly, it could take 5 minutes. A normal game where I do finish from beginning to end, the whole game probably takes 30 to 45 minutes. It could take longer. Depends on the scenario, but yeah, it works well. You could play solo as a single player, or you could play two-handed where you're pretending to be two people. There is benefits to being two people in that there's more synergy and some abilities that as a single player don't come up. There's something called Sentinel. If a character has Sentinel, that character can block creatures attacking one of the other players. If you're playing solo, there's only one team, one player, and therefore Sentinel just doesn't apply. There aren't any other players to defend for. So you lose something by playing solo, but it otherwise, and the normal synergy thing that you have in most cooperative games where you have 2 or 3 characters that could complement each other, that would also be lost in multiplayer. But a solo player, you're actually taking in 3 heroes, and there's still synergy among your heroes and your cards. So I don't feel there's a loss to play solo. I enjoy playing solo. I enjoy playing 2-player with my son. I've enjoyed multiplayer games, and they're all fun. Yeah, they feel a little bit different, but they're all satisfying. And the difficulty tends to scale pretty well. Though a game that is easy solo might be hard multiplayer and vice versa. So it's not always perfect scalability, and I doubt anything ever is when it comes to this sort of thing. But yeah. So I do like the game. And I said about getting into the game now. I think it's very doable because you could buy the new base set with a better distribution of cards and better more of each card and all that. And it isn't overwhelming. And then you could buy the extra scenarios or adventures as you're ready for them, the 3 they made. But like I said, you're not gonna be able to get the older ones, which is a bit of a shame. And I know for me that'll give me a feeling of being left out. I give me a feeling like there's some exclusivity to the game, and that would annoy me and turn me off from the game. I know this, but even then, it is a fun game. And if you could, just ignore the fact that you can't get all the older cards, you'll just have to settle for what is available now, whatever you could find, I guess, online and aftermarket sort of stuff. The reason they chose to release the scenarios they did, my understanding is that they picked the ones that were most emblematic of Lord of the Rings stories, like ones that felt like representative. And some of the earlier ones, maybe I think they felt, and this is from what I've heard online or podcasts that I listen to, but I'm not really super familiar with this myself. But my understanding is that they felt some of the earlier scenarios were not as strong, or maybe not well balanced, because the game was still new and they're still learning how to design for it, I guess. So the later content tends to be better. And some of the later content is, for example, there's one campaign, the Haradrim, I forget what the actual campaign cycle is called, but you're going through the deserts of Poros, I believe the place is called. And it follows the campaigns. They kind of traveled around a map where you went to one place and in one campaign, then you did another campaign, and now you got on the ocean and went somewhere else and ended up in the southern end of Middle Earth. And then the next campaign, you went through the desert and headed back north. So you kind of did this huge big circle, sort of. That whole desert doesn't feel like Lord of the Rings. It's not something you kind of think of when you think in Lord of the Rings. So it felt odd, and so they didn't feel like that was a good representative scenario or campaign to include. Hopefully they will, because it's playable. Lots of good cards, more options. All that work is done. It would be just a matter of repackaging and printing it again. So it seems like it'd be a simple punt to get that made. I guess it depends on times and resources and their priorities. Gosh, yeah, that's Lord of the Rings. That's Back to the Table. It's a really fun game. It's worth exploring. You can find used stuff out there, and you might be able to save some money. unless you really want to go all in that case, yeah, you're going to spend a fortune no matter what, whether you're buying a brand new retail or whatever. But it is a game you could definitely dig into and see how you like and explore and expand, because there is new content being made by aLeP that I mentioned, and I think others also make new content here and there. They're just the only ones that are trying to. I think they're the only ones that are succeeding at doing something that feels like a continuation of what has come. All right, that's Lord of the Rings. That's way, way more than I actually thought I would manage to say, but I guess I really like this game, so there's a lot to say there. It's a game I would recommend, especially if you're somebody like Lord of the Rings and that fiction. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. We love feedback, so we love hearing from you. You can reach me at julius@oneplayerpodcast.com or JLBird on BGG, and Albert can be reached at albert@oneplayerpodcast.com or Fractaloon on BGG. Our website is oneplayerpodcast.com with the number 1, and we're also on Twitter at oneplayerpodcast. The intro music is copyright Angus, can be found at jamendo.com. The transition music is copyright by Dan Elduce Pancaldi, whose page is at donpancaldi.com. The One Player Podcast is protected under a Creative Commons share-alike license. Thanks for listening.